Mr. Beacon podcast is sponsored by Wiliot, scaling IoT with battery-free Bluetooth.
So welcome to the Mr. Beacon podcast. This week we are delving into digital to physical convergence, the Internet of Apparel, a sustainability twist, and a very interesting project which is I think going to potentially yield some great opportunities in the world of apparel, some great opportunities to help save the planet, and certainly something that's very thought-provoking. And for this discussion, we've got Dr. Kevin Dooley, who's joining us in part of his role as the chief scientist for the Sustainability Consortium. So, Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure. Can you maybe introduce the Sustainability Consortium first, and then after that we'll delve into a bit about your background, and then this project called Wherever, which is really fascinating.
Excellent. So the Sustainability Consortium, we just achieved our 10th anniversary. And it's a joint effort between Arizona State University and University of Arkansas. And we were started a decade ago in order to see what we could do to make consumer products more sustainable. And so the general notion was that up to that point, companies and brands had a portion of their product portfolio that they might designate as green under some type of environmental or social attribute. And that's a great first step, but our goal was really to look at all product categories and all products sold in those categories and determine a way to make them more sustainable. And so we set out with about 100 corporate and NGO stakeholders, a number of other academic institutions, and first of all did the materiality assessment on 100 different product categories like bananas or computers or cotton textiles. And from those social and environmental hotspots based on the science that we knew, then developed key performance indicators that then suppliers use to report their progress to their retail consumers. And there have even been some breakouts of then sharing that information with the consumers themselves. And so we're most known for that development and stewardship of the Walmart Sustainability Index. But our members have also been interested in, now can we do something about those hotspots? And so a lot of our members, especially in the kind of durable goods sectors, have expressed interest in various circular economy projects. And so that's kind of how Project Wherever got initiated, because we saw there was a lot of potential interest amongst our members and other corporate and NGO and technology providers.
Just to round out the TSC, the Sustainability Consortium, you've got some very significant members. You said there was over 100 even at the founding. Can you name drop a few of the players in that?
Well, so from a retail perspective, I mentioned that Walmart has been kind of our lead user, but more recently in the last couple of years we've had implementations by Target, Amazon, Sprouts, Kroger.
Significant, very significant.
Yes.
So you have a broad net, and this is not just sort of a post in a check for $1,000. This is a fairly significant commitment these companies make to participate. And just before we get into Wherever, any kind of notable achievements that you can point to in terms of these hotspots that you talked about identifying, and has there been any progress over the last decade?
So it's been about 5 years that it's been operant in the field. Okay. And so we're covering about $1 trillion worth of product sales. So that's about 1/15 of the global retail trade. Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of potential economic impact. There's about 2,500 suppliers that have participated, and we have seen that, first of all, there's been an improvement in the underlying scores. So most of the questions, most of the hotspots for any product manufacturer exist in their supply chain. So most of the KPIs address supply chain transparency and performance. And really, you can't really get concerned too much about performance until you have that first step of even having the transparency of knowing who your suppliers are. Are they actually doing anything about GHGs or water or labor rights? And so we've seen those supply chain transparency scores increase from an average of about 30% and now 5 years later to about 45%. And we've also seen that those suppliers that have participated in multiple years generally have higher scores. So it looks like it takes about 2 to 3 years for any large corporation or medium-sized corporation to put in the measurement systems at both their own factories and within their supply chain to begin to collect sustainability-related data. And then, in terms of changes to product and process and whatnot and packaging, about 85% of suppliers who report say that they've done something in the past year to basically improve their KPI score. And so that's kind of our theory of change. And so we see that suppliers are actually doing stuff directly linked to the KPIs. And again, it takes about 2 to 3 years, let's say, to make a packaging change. Right, so if you think about going through the design process, you've still got to include all the advertising for marketing purposes on there. If it's a new formulation, you might have to change suppliers, change out equipment. So we're getting a sense of what the feasible pace of sustainable change is in the corporate world.
Yeah, very good. And then lastly, before we get into wherever, tell us a bit about your background. What do you do when you're not the chief scientist?
I'm a professor of supply chain management at Arizona State University, and I was trained as an industrial engineer at University of Illinois, taught for 10 years at University of Minnesota, and then have been here at ASU for 22 years. Have moved from my industrial engineering background more to business and supply chain, and a lot of stuff around new product development, and a lot of my research isn't focused on sustainability. It's about supplier innovation, basically how manufacturers can tap into their supply base for sources of innovation.
Very cool. So where did it come from, and what are you trying to do?
So I have to credit a gentleman named John Atchison, who is the CEO of an app called Stuffster. Stuffster is a startup that has been, I think, has gotten some initial VC funding. That had a very successful pilot launch with the UK clother John Lewis, and they operate both a back-end and front-end system that will essentially allow people, first of all, to have a digital library of the things that they own, and then on top of that, get an immediate assessment of its resale value, and then essentially have someone pick it up that night if they want and put money in their store account. And I know that the pilot with John Lewis, I think I know the numbers reliably, that about like a quarter of what John Lewis had sold over, I can't exactly remember the time frame, maybe the last 2 or 3 years, was returned in this particular pilot project. And so it shows that there's a pent-up demand that people have for a channel that's convenient and that could give them some monetary remuneration, but I think most of all that convenience for product take-back of clothing.
So the people buy the clothing, they wear it, and then they give it back to John Lewis?
They would, Stuffster would run the take-back system, and then Stuffter would resell it in other distribution channels. And that information obviously would be used analytically by John Lewis, and this is another way of kind of, I think generally retailers are interested in ways that they can remain, they can communicate on an ongoing basis with consumers, and so this is an example of that. And John and his company are a member of the CE 100 group in the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as is Arizona State University. And so that's how we got connected. And he came to us asking the question, what do we know about how long products are used and how often they're used? And in our work in the Sustainability Consortium, we found a big knowledge gap there. I mean, if you think about it, we can define the life cycle of a consumer product, and we can identify 1,000+ distinct steps, from the farm or the forest or the metal extraction all the way to end of life and recycling, all the intricacies that we can model. And there's this thing in the middle called the consumer and the use phase. And it's a big black box. And we have no idea really what goes on there. And for particular consumer behaviors around particular attributes, yes, there's been lots of studies. So there's lots of studies of cold water washing by consumers, or do consumers turn the lights off in their house, or do they unplug their utilities to not have passive electricity use. But for the most part, it's a black box. So that seemed intriguing just as a scientist, we really don't know very much. As we went and saw the reaction to this question in the CE 100 meeting in Phoenix, there were all these retailers and brands and universities and service providers, technology providers, who were in the room just super psyched about the question. And so we were intrigued anyway, but then when we saw that kind of interest amongst people across various different sectors and value chain positions, we're like, this is something hot. And so TSC offered to kind of facilitate a planning process through the calendar year 2018. We fell upon clothing as the category that most of the participants were interested in, received a grant from a foundation so that we can begin to essentially do pilot demonstrations in 2019. So our interest is that we see that this is going to explode with or without us. There's just all sorts of marketers and positive drivers and initial investment in using digital technology to track clothing and to track products more generally. And we think that there are certain things that would be advantaged to do in a pre-competitive space, especially around standards to measure utilization, analytics, and hopefully the development of perhaps a benchmarking platform that brands and retailers and consumers can use that incentivizes companies who want to design clothing that has superior longevity, but also superior utilization over its lifetime.
Okay, so you're trying to extend, one of the opportunities at least is to extend the life of products and to make them used more. And, we often at Williott, when we kind of talk about building on the shoulders of what Amazon have done, Amazon know you so well. They know everything about what you browse and then the conversion to buying and so forth. But what they don't know is, do I actually use these things that I bought? This is the black hole the black box that you referenced. So it seems like there's a real opportunity here to have people, if not own the product longer, then maybe this product has another life after the first ownership. How practical is it for us to expect that companies whose motive is presumably to sell as much stuff as possible to really, well, first of all, support and then actually do anything about making these products last longer if it means they're going to sell less stuff?
Yeah. So a couple different answers to that. Maybe I could start and kind of summarize that from my initial assessment of the activity in this domain, that there are two main drivers. And whenever you look at kind of adoption of technology, sometimes it's not the technology itself that's being adopted, but rather there's larger trends that are going on that it gets swept up into. And so The first is that we have been tracking inventory in the supply chain with RFID tags and other technologies for a long time. That's a clear business proposition. Companies know the value of that and invest in it and are continuing to increase their investment in it. And so this is an extension of that inventory tracking. And I think that those interested in that application are particularly interested in what happens and where it goes after its first life. So they want to make sure that the user knows, for example, proper recycling or where they can take it to get donated and those types of things. And then they want to then make sure that that inventory comes back into a closed loop. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of money and business cases already for inventory tracking. This is an extension of it. But there may or may not be applications in use. It's more about making sure that you know where the thing goes at the end of first life. Then the other driver I see are essentially marketing opportunities. So there's, with most products and clothing included, there's not a natural opportunity to continue to communicate to the consumer post-sale. And both the brands and the retailers have interest in this particular application. In some cases, it may be, you may consider it push marketing, right? And so it's basically marketing. Maybe it's about similar products. Maybe it's some kind of benefit that you get. Maybe a customized song list, for example, that you can download because you're wearing a particular item. But I think it also goes to consumer instruction and even safety. So, for example, I know this is outside of clothing, but I know a technology firm that's developing technology whereby it would monitor the number of pills in a pharmaceutical bottle and we're able to tell essentially, with the trigger being the cap opening, if the proper dosage was taken, if it had been forgotten, and so on, mm-hmm. and then could communicate back to the consumer. So yes. I think, it's on one hand, it's the inventory tracking. On the other hand, it's the marketing and consumer education. So I think that both of those applications then are going to drive the interest in tracking consumers' usage of products.
And I want to come back to these points, but let's just get into a bit of the how. We kind of talked about a little bit about what and why. How are you tracking this? How are you instrumenting the black box today with the project?
So in the consortium, we don't have the capabilities to develop technology ourselves. It's not our expertise. And we have a tradition of not essentially picking winners. So we don't say that paper is better than plastic or whatnot, mm-hmm. Because of course we know as scientists that answer is it depends. Mm-hmm. So what is the best technology? It depends. Our interest is in, first of all, in a very short term, to be a champion for the opportunity, because we think the opportunity needs to get exposed if there's going to be industry-wide adoption. So part of our interest in the upcoming year is just to demonstrate the use case so that we can begin to bring publicity and awareness from firms in the industry. But the second is to, again, figure out how we should measure these things, and we think that should be done in a pre-competitive context. And so our experience in multi-stakeholder facilitation, developing measurement systems is, our interest and my obsession it kind of led me to this particular target of objectives.
Well, you've got a really great picture which I'm very tempted to reuse on your website that shows this product life cycle. It would be good to just kind of talk through that cycle. I don't know if you have it in your head, but so the kind of the concept here for maybe the experiment or maybe on an ongoing basis is what you have. Let's say it's RFID. So you have a RFID tag that is presumably integrated at some point into the item of apparel.
Right.
Generally, these things get removed today. They're on a cardboard tag, but there's because for various reasons, privacy reasons and so forth. But is the plan to put these tags on the apparel that certain subjects that participate in the Wherever study have on all of their clothing? What's the idea?
Right. So maybe let me step back a little bit and kind of talk about the conceptual model.
Yeah.
That is maybe in the 3-year time frame. So we conceive of 3 different dimensions that describe the state of a garment. The first that we normally think about is its physical state. And so we have design attributes, including information about like how the product was made. You know, was the material sustainably sourced? Is there recycled content in it? As well as SKU level identification information about the particular family of product, the make, the pattern, the color, size, etc. So there's all that metadata that exists about the state of the garment at production. And then ideally over time, you'd also like to have some way of measuring the physical integrity of the garment over time. And that will, you know, that eventually will require some type of image recognition capability, but it's not infeasible given how often people take pictures of themselves. Then you have the emotional state, which is a relationship between the consumer and the garment. And the reality is in clothing, we don't know whether physical integrity or emotional integrity is the main driver of people stopping to use their clothes. We have a sense in media and technology that it's that emotional relationship, that it's no longer stylish. There's a new model out. It's not that the cell phone is not operable anymore, right? But we don't know the answer to that fundamental question in clothing. So in the long run, if we had a way to measure through the way that consumers, for example, posted on social media about particular garments, the sentiment that they used in talking about the garment in those posts, whatever measures that might be available. We have a second measure now of emotional integrity, which is also dynamic. The third is the physical location of the item, which infers its use state, but there's some complexities there. So we have to think about a garment as a piece of inventory that moves through different positions in the household. There's a storage area where it's dormant. There may be a long-term storage area where you actually have to move it out of, like my winter boots here in Phoenix, right, to actually be used. There's in use. That in use could be in the house. It could be outside of the house. And then there's what we often don't think of, there's the queuing system for maintenance. We can think about bringing laundry out, to a laundromat, but there's just in our house, we've got the laundry room. There's a queue waiting to get washed. There's a queue waiting to get dried. There's even a queue waiting to get stored away. And until clothing makes its way through that system, it's not available for reuse. So this is one of the initial insights that we gained from thinking about the system in this model, is that the amount of clothing inventory that people have is directly related to essentially the queue size and the throughput time of their laundering process. So in college, I owned 30 T-shirts, and it's because I only went to the laundromat once a month. So I had to own 30 T-shirts. So we don't often think about that as a reason why we own so many clothes, but that's a practical implication of thinking about clothing as inventory. So there are a couple different ways, if we look at the dominant technologies that are likely to be used, which would be RFID. It could be RFID tags, but there also now are RFID threads. Mm-hmm. And then there's tags that convey digital information in different ways. So NFC tags, QR codes. Mm-hmm. And then I think we have Bluetooth devices that then also might embed other types of sensors. So we've thought, for example, that motion sensors or temperature sensors might also have application to this use case. And they require different levels of consumer engagement. which means convenience. So I think that right now we have RFID tags in the inventory supply chain. They're used in the retail shop, as you mentioned. So from that sense, it makes sense to extend RFID into the rest of the value chain. It has the positive attribute that it doesn't require the consumer to engage the system, right? If the garment passes with an RFID tag within proximity of the reader, then you can record that event. The constraint is that readers are expensive, and so they make sense on a truck, they make sense in a retail shop, they make sense in a distribution center. Today, they don't make sense at high scale in a home. And so there, we look towards solutions that require consumer engagement. In the case of a QR code or an NFC tag, your phone can read them. So you've got that convenience, but the consumer has to remember to engage. In the case of NFC, they've got to bring their phone basically to contact with the tag. Right, the distance is about the thickness of your phone, and then with the QR codes, you have more distance because you're using your camera, but you also have light constraints. So the QR codes don't work great in low light, and then the Bluetooth, as you know, and we've talked about. Which may be connected to a simple positional indicator or be linked to some other sensor. The constraint there has been the power source. So if you can come up with a solution that has a way to deal with that power source solution, and you can develop devices that are still environmentally benign. Because they will be thrown into landfill, they will be attempted to be recycled, then that has the interesting attributes that it doesn't require the consumer to actively engage, but at the same time it has a much longer potential range of and level of precision around positional accuracy that you don't have with the others.
So I've been describing this to people, rightly or wrongly, as having the potential of being the Nielsen for the clothing industry.
Sure.
Nielsen studies for people back in the world days when people used to watch TV. They were like the Bible, where everyone, and they took a sample. They didn't watch everyone that watched the television. They had a sample audience, and they instrumented their set-top box, and then all of the television executives used to race to see the numbers. So is that a reasonable metaphor? And in particular, are you seeing, how big is the sample? Is this going to be kind of a study, a moment in time, you think, where there'll be a few dozen people participating in this? Or do you see a bigger sample size? Or do you see this just being part of the way clothing is made, and you have permanent feedback from a whole range of different washing machines and social media apps that are constantly providing this information? Where do you see it, and how close is it to this Nielsen idea?
A couple different answers there. I think the Nielsen metaphor is perfect, right on target. And the fact is that both a particular brand and the industry can learn a lot with far less than 100% sample. There's tens of millions of opportunities to engage consumers, even if you only have 10% of consumers engaged in conversations about clothing. So regardless of where your sustainability stance is, regardless of how strongly you feel the need that my main objective, all else doesn't matter, is to sell more clothes, brands want to talk to consumers because it is in fact a way to sell more clothes. So this is a means to do that. So I think that for that reason, this will have a solid business argument, even for companies that you state whose mission is to make new clothes and to get them sold. Mm-hmm. The other opportunity there is the contagion effect. So if you think about when a new product is released to market, you want to be able to predict its demand. And so going into the release of a new SKU into the market, you've got your sales forecast from previous sales. And once you release it into the market, you've got your sales data on a daily basis or even real-time basis. You've got social media buzz that you can track, but you don't know if the clothing's being used. And the thing about clothing is that if you don't wear it, then there's no potential for contagion between one consumer and another. There's no possibility of peer communication. Unless you wear it and take a picture of it, or you wear it outside the house, no one is going to know that you own that product. You're not signaling that you own the product. But if you do, then there's that potential for contagion. And clothing, perhaps more than any other attribute, has that potential for, once there's visual recognition in a real social context, then all of a sudden, I think I'd like to get that, right? And so if you had data about utilization, even in just the first 4 weeks of a release, it would seem that that could be really useful business information from a market forecast standpoint. And then also, if you think about the applications that can then engage both the company to consumer, but also consumer to consumer, then you have the potential for buzz, for micro-influencing, and those other business opportunities. So in terms of the size, we're one effort amongst maybe a half dozen that I know of that are at kind of all the same stage of doing kind of laboratory pilot experiments. There are technology providers like Eon that just yesterday announced the Fashion Connect effort, which is a very important initiative to standardize the metadata that will be collected on tags. And they have brands, clients that they're working with. There are other technology providers, Blue Byte, that also have brands that they're working with. I've been aware of Cisco's efforts here, IDEO's efforts here. And I think there are demonstrations in the level of dozens to maybe 100. Here on the university, I hope that we can hit 100 or 200 participants here in the fall. Then I think next year we're looking at the thousands. And I think by that time, ideally you'd have enough of a critical mass of clothing manufacturers that you could begin to get some legitimacy towards both the business opportunity and the kind of pre-competitive issues that make sense to collaborate on.
Yeah, that's a fascinating. You just touched on something there. If you have competitors, and this is, I'm sure, nothing new for the Sustainability Consortium, you have a bunch of competitors who are all collaborating. Have you thought a little bit about the data issues in terms of A, competitive access to this, and B, the privacy issues? I guess if you've got 100 people in the study, then they're like saying, I'm doing this for the greater good. I don't care if you know how often I wash my underwear. But is there, what are your thoughts on data ownership and privacy?
I think it's critical. It's one of the reasons why we thought there was a role for us, because we're afraid that industry, if they play alone here, will not develop a shared privacy stance and set of standards. Our belief is that we need to ensure that that happens. I'm not 100% sure that we need to make it happen. So part of this digital data may be embedded in a broader context. So for example, there's an initiative called the Hub of All Things, in which people have an individual digital account of basically information that can be related to them, and then they're allowed to essentially enable external entities access to that information. So maybe that at a different technical level of the system, privacy is that's where privacy is addressed. And certainly at the very technical level, if you're talking the wires and connectors and stuff and waves, again, I think that security is best handled at that technical layer. I do think, you're never going to develop a used corporate or industry measurement system if it is used for shaming, right? So it has to be used to identify leaders and to allow leaders a way to legitimately make claims about their leadership. And so that's kind of the principle. I don't know what the right answer is, but that's kind of the principle of how I would see kind of brand anonymity, even retailer anonymity, user anonymity, that you have to be very careful about it being misused, or you don't really want companies to be able to say, we're better than company X, because of this data. That's not, I could see a system like that, but again, I think that we have experience with the sustainability index to know kind of what can be made public, what cannot be, what level of detail, et cetera, to make all the stakeholders happy.
Very cool. Well, I am just so excited by what you're doing. I think it's really awesome. And I love the fact that it is, you can see, there's some great ideas which will make the planet better. Yeah, extending the life of clothing, second use of clothing. But you think, no, this is never going to, it's against people's interests. But you can see a real value for the participants to know, okay, I sold this thing. How often are they wearing it? I mean, that's such an important question. And then, many other ways that businesses can benefit. So this is exciting because it really does seem like the concept is sustainable as well as it supporting environmental sustainability. Any major things that we could touch on before we sign off? It seems like you've got some good momentum here.
Well, again, thank you so much for your kind words. I think that in general, our life is being turned into information. One of the interesting things I learned about this week is that there's a number of design firms that are being bought up by essentially consulting companies or other business entities who are in the information business. So I think there's a growing trend towards looking at products as information. This also links to our move to servitize, right? So instead of we owning the product in the physical way, we purchase the service. And in that context, it's super important, right, for the brand manufacturer or the service provider to know how the product is being used. So we see that with like the HP, ink, where in fact the HP ink cartridge is communicating, right, with the system to know when it needs to be refilled. So I think the general trend here is that, IoT will enable information, and then there'll be all sorts of business value opportunities to make use of that information.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, Kevin, it's been very exciting. So glad that we got a chance to talk, and I'm sure we'll be talking again. Thanks for joining the show.
Thank you. Good luck to you.
I don't know if you got to look at the briefing notes, but we have this tradition on the show where we ask our guests what music they would take on a trip to Mars. And I was wondering if you'd had a chance to think about that. Is music an important part of your life? Or
very important, yes. Yeah, so that was an intriguing question. It would have been very difficult on the spot, but yes, I have some answers.
Excellent. Well, let's get into it then. What are your top three?
So first I would choose, there's so many different rock albums that are so classic to choose, it's hard to do so. So I'm going to be selfish and pick my own college rock band that we called the New Originals, which was a name that we stole from the Spinal Tap movie. And we did a 30-minute open jam called Remove the Water. And we had a bunch of electronic devices that we didn't know how to use and just flipped the record switch on and went. And so it's one of those things where you look back and you say, I could never recreate this, but I'm glad that at one moment in my life, something emerged from our meanderings that was listenable, at least listenable amongst 3 or 4 people.
Oh, that's really
cool. Then I would choose Max Richter's Sleep.
Okay.
So first of all, Sleep was composed to be listened to as you slept through the night. So I'm getting 8 hours of music from one album, and I think it's the most, for a long trip to Mars, you need some ambient music. So I choose Max Richter. And then I would practically, as a third choice, choose some form of white noise for sleeping, and background noise as I work. So maybe a recording of railroad track sounds.
Amazing. So no Brian Eno. Maybe you could sneak a bit of Brian Eno, his ambient recordings in there.
Well, with modern technology, we can just stream it, and I don't mind if it takes 2 hours to get there. So
Okay.
I assume that we'll have access to streaming services.
Excellent. Well, some very original nominations there. Very, very interesting. Thanks very much for those.